Hello and welcome to this video on why it is that armor evolved to become more and more ornate from the medieval age, through to the Renaissance and then practically disappeared. And no, it's not just that firearms exist. If you look at history, armor begins life as a fairly simple structure. First, it begins with pieces of metal that are attached to either leather or fabric of some description, and then it becomes overlapping plates of metal. Then this becomes chainmail due to technology reverting and the Dark Ages. Once technology catches up, armor became more segmented and stronger, but it gradually became more and more ornate. And this last element might seem like it was just vanity, but there is more to it. The ornate elements that seemingly just are a vanity project that were added did more than just make the armor look nice, it made it stronger. This is one reason why metal plate armor remained in use long after firearms became common. To understand what happened, we need to look at several things. The first is about the metallurgy, the second is geometry of the armor, the third and finally is comparing it to firearms, which were the biggest threat to a knight on the battlefield, other than a 10-meter long pike, and that is not a reference to your boyfriend or your girlfriend's boyfriend. Let's start with the year 1200, where mail armor was being replaced with plate on a large enough scale to be innovated on in significant ways. By the 14th century, it was the mainstay or common armor of a knight, and even infantry were increasingly being armed, if not completely with plate, at least a solid chest piece or cuirass. At this time, this was also the fairly early days of industrialization. Importantly, what we're thinking of is the invention of the water hammer. Now, this invention is incredibly relevant as the water hammer was powered by a water mill, and that allowed steel to be beaten consistently and for a long time. Something a human simply cannot do. It's a phenomena that if you put a smith or an armorer in a workshop for long enough, they will tire out. The water mill powered hammer will not. By 1500, steel was common and was made in just about all parts of the world relevant to this video, but places such as Germany had very industrial and advanced techniques, let's say, and they actually got to a point where they started having industrialization to a point where they were rolling metal. This created consistency, and it meant they could then cut the steel to the shape required, and then they could size it according to each individual. But it meant they could create a large-scale production of steel that could then be turned into armor, and it was consistent, reasonably homogeneous armor. Importantly, this was a key part to what happens next. It is by the 15th century that we see real changes in armor. It no longer relied on external displays of ostentatious wealth via cloth and surcoats, but instead the armor itself became a showpiece. Now, if you have something incredibly fancy, you often want to show it off, and this is why men in their 40s buy a Ferrari. It also makes up for their other shortcomings. In the medieval time, it's seen in, amongst other things, but starting with the Italian style of plate armor. This is where we see the more comprehensive use of curves, rounded shapes, and, let's say, enhancements. Now, some of the enhancements were just that, but others were intended to deflect blows away and not just absorb them. During the medieval period, we also see a change from iron through to steel on a much larger scale. Now, let's be clear about this. Not all plate armor was steel, and not all plate armor was iron. There was, right throughout the time frame it was in common usage, a relative mix. It became increasingly common to see steel used towards the end, but you still had iron, and at the start there was very few, but nonetheless impressive, pieces of steel armor. To start with though, iron armor was primarily available and most prevalent at its, let's say, the start of the medieval time, because it was largely available, but this was down to improved manufacturing techniques. Iron armor had a number of advantages, and this pretty much made it the go-to choice. Other than the fact that, well, unlike, say, a leather or cloth, it wasn't likely to be cut through. It's metal, after all. But also, it could resist a lot of blunt force impact, whether that is an axe, a club, being hit by a lance, and so on. This would reduce the severity of injuries, but it did come with a cost, and this cost was that iron weighed a lot more. Italian plate armor is sort of where we see a tipping point, where we go from iron to steel, and this is in that 14th to 16th century period. What happened was that they went from iron to steel, but it wasn't just one kind of steel, and this is rather important, because rather than focusing on just being wrought iron, we now have individual kinds of steel used in different ways, and because each of these has its own benefits, characteristics, and unique applications, in a manner of speaking, they became a more comprehensive set. First you have a mild steel. Now, mild steel is, as the name suggests, not particularly special in all respects. But what makes it good is that it is, well, first of all, very affordable. After all, you're not having to do a lot of other work to it. But what work you do need to do, because it is malleable, is relatively easy. This means that you could use it for tasks where you're not so worried about having to worry about the particularities. For instance, if a piece is going to be static and not going to have to worry about moving, this is a good idea. But then if you need to worry about things being movable, for example around the waist and hips, this is where spring steel would come into play. Spring steel was flexible, and it could deal with repeated stress. And then finally, we have high carbon steel. Now, high carbon steel is very strong and very hard, but it's also very difficult to work because it's hard. This means that it will be able to deal with a lot of brutal damage, but unfortunately it'll be very hard to make whatever you need. Into the 16th century, a few odd things happen after these initial developments, let's say. You now have a range of steels being used, and they're replacing iron, and they're all specialized, but you also now see the increasing prevalence of heat treating that steel. Now, heat treating is something we've touched on before in other videos related to bonsai tools and bluing, but what it is you take your metal, primarily speaking here about a steel or steel for the purposes of this video, let's say, and you heat it up to a certain point. Now, this certain point is generally just below when it begins to liquefy, and then you quench it very quickly. Now, this causes it to harden. That hardening is good in that it's now able to deal with a lot of damage, let's say, but it's also very brittle as a result. The heat treating process that follows after this is the annealing step. Annealing is when you heat it up again but let it cool back down. This creates a layer of softer, more mild steel that's been annealed and an inner core of hardened steel. The outer softer steel can be brutalized by being slashed at, hacked at, and beaten on, but it won't be brittle, and therefore it will dent and become banged up, but it won't break. The inner steel, because it is arguably more brittle, would normally have snapped, but because it's only getting the force slowly transferred through that more mild steel, it can deal with that harsh treatment and basically be the backbone. It's like a rebar inside of concrete. Where this gets weird though is that you have this technological development occurring towards the 16th century or just into it, but by the end of the 16th century and start of the 17th century certainly, we see that it's no longer being used, which is just plain odd. Now, we've already touched on the fact that much of the development so far have been based on the availability of the technology. For example, blast furnaces to take iron and turn it into a steel basically, and that they were able to reasonably consistently and effectively lower the carbon content. But it also meant that due to some of the issues around this, and the fact that it was relatively early in the time frame and technological development, it was an inexact science and process, which often meant that some of the people making what was meant to be steel ended up producing just plain wrought iron, which wasn't anywhere near as effective for steel, or at least it wasn't a replacement for steel, but it could do some of the same jobs. This brings us to the most common form of armor you might think of, especially in relation to this video, and it's called Gothic plate armor. Gothic plate armor is armor that is incredibly decorative. It has many fluting sections on it, it's very elaborate, and the designs are comprehensive, more or less providing from the very tip of your toes to the top of your head armoring, with almost no chainmail to speak of. Now, the first things to mention are the fluting that we've just touched on, and it's part of what makes this armor both so fancy and aesthetically pleasing. It is effectively the curves, the linear lines, the bends and undulations that make it fit to the body. Admittedly, this design was later somewhat sublimated by Maximilian armor, which basically built on the existing design features, but it was somewhat more resilient to firearms. But this brings us to what makes it, in terms of the geometry of the armor, just that much better. But it's also why, by the 18th century, plate armor became something of a moot point. Many of the features we've spoken about just could not be justified given the weight of armor needed, the lack of vision, and almost no movement if you wanted to at least have a somewhat bulletproof cuirass, and, ideally, entire suit of armor. If we look at what they were doing, we can compare it in some ways to the tank development of World War II. It's where you see a competition between the viability of the tank, for example the Panzer IV, versus the power, armor, and everything else of a bigger, heavier tank like the Tiger, or the T-34 versus the IS series, the Death Turtle or Doom Turtle versus something like a Sherman, so on and so forth. But we can actually compare, in some ways, fluting to that slanted or angled armor on tanks. That's because it creates a much greater angle from horizontal, and this increases the depth or thickness of the armor. This also means that any blow that can land cannot land perpendicular, and that prevents a clean strike. With regards to functional thickness, let's use the simple War Thunder comparison. You have your tank head-on with a set thickness of armor. This is exactly how thick that piece of steel was as it came out of the factory and got cut into shape for the tank. Being a set thickness, if you have a big enough force or round, and it penetrates, your crew meets the pointy end and explosive filler of said round. If you rotate the tank just slightly, you find that the functional thickness changes. That is because the straight line now is going through a more metal. This increases until you get to a point where it starts going thin again. Fluting does exactly the same thing, it's just on a smaller scale and many times over. It's just like how corrugated steel or even cardboard is stronger for its weight and the material used than an equivalent amount of flat or straight cardboard. In the case of armor, by incorporating these as part of the design, they could make the suit of armor much stronger without having to use as much material, and certainly by reducing the amount of weight the knight or other combatant had to carry. At the same time, it also meant that any strike that attempted to land could never land on the entirety of the armor in one go. There was no way to penetrate all of it. It meant that any damage had to pass through multiple areas that were at different times and in different places. This makes a damaging strike much harder to achieve, and certainly a penetrating strike much more difficult. If we're talking about a reinforced section, not exactly a joint or similar, which are typically much more vulnerable. Of course, that's not the only feature. You have other features, for example reinforcing along the crown, or the location and design of helmets. There are all sorts of other features that made the initial blunt force trauma much more easy to deal with, or in some cases almost unnoticeable, as it would transfer the entirety of the force into the armor and the person inside it wouldn't really experience it. Now that we've spoken about the metals used and the design features and how important these are, it brings us to comparing it to firearms. And it's more or less why people say armor simply went out of fashion. Well, yes and no. By the mid-1500s, armor was still being considered relatively bulletproof, literally by proofing its resistance by shooting it point blank, and with the armor not being penetrated. This pattern continued into the 1600s, but it's noteworthy that these are exceptions, effectively apocryphal tales and survivor bias stories. Nonetheless, by the end of the 16th century and going into the 17th century, the armor we might expect to see on a knight, where they are wearing plate from the tips of their toes to the crown of their head, isn't necessarily common anymore. Instead, the armor was often much heavier on either the front-facing sides or the outsides of the body, but little to no armor on the parts of the body that would not be immediately exposed to the enemy. For example, the insides of the thigh, where, theoretically, they would be hard against a horse, and therefore they would be protected by the outside armor. This was part of a larger, roughly 300-year period, where both firearms and plate armor very much coexisted, with them both being used in different ways, and it led to a larger change in tactics and strategy, rather than a cessation of one or the other. What did have a significant effect was the velocity or projectile speed, and as the size of the projectiles went up, the value of armor, and consequently the need for speed, began to change. Imagine today what an anti-material rifle does, and think that in a medieval age this was a somewhat similar comparison. It may not make a knight do a vanishing trick, but the recipient might wish it did. At least prior to that point, you could, to a certain extent, still expect armor to reliably stop the rifle rounds, or arquebus, musket, and so on. But as they got more powerful and more accurate, or at least more common so that massed volleys could hit something, it didn't really make much sense. And of course, this all relates to handheld firearms, such as arquebusiers, matchlocks, wheellocks, and flintlocks. Cannons are an entirely different matter, as that is something that even fortifications could not resist, let alone the flesh meat bag enclosed in steel riding on a horse. And finally, we have at least partly theory and partly opinion as to why a plate armor lost out. By the height of the 1560s and coming into the 16th century, armor, to a certain extent, couldn't really compete. And we don't mean that on a one-to-one basis, we mean on a large scale. While every soldier wore armor, or at least every professional soldier wore a certain amount of armor, this also meant a huge investment in armor that was countered and destroyed by a firearm that, while expensive, did not compare to the time, expense, and expertise required to make armor. Also, armor had to be made for a person, or at least broadly. A firearm did not. A firearm was made by the artisan that made it, and then individuals had to adjust ammunition, but that's about all of the customization that was needed. As long as you had someone with at least a mildly working brain, they could eventually be taught how to use a firearm. Armor, on the other hand, had to be maintained. You had to learn how to wear it, how to work with it, how to fight in armor, and so on. And certainly trying to equip, say, an army or a garrison guard in plate armor was too great an ask, and it just wasn't practical. Not when you could give anyone with a even remotely working brain a firearm and have them learning how to shoot in under half a day. And it would cost you a lot less, especially if you went from having a permanent professional army to having a militia, or in other cases just levies armed with these sort of effective weapons. Although plate armor lost popularity, it remained in use in the form of cuirasses or chest plates. The reason for this is simple enough: it protected the abdomen and chest from at least some of the lethal blows, and was good enough in most cases. A peripheral hit from one of these weapons would cause harm and possibly lead to the loss of limb, but it wouldn't kill, but it would handicap. On the other hand, even if you wore armor, you weren't going to stop any of these shots. And that's simply because the sheer size of even older ammunition. The simple reality is modern bullets, although they go faster, are infinitely smaller. This is also to an extent why your fancy knight armor was more than just ostentatious ornamentation, but it was also a practical and functional choice. That was one thing that contributed to saving the life of the wearer, and why it continued to be used long after firearms became common. You were more likely to survive being shot at, and in some cases there are records of being shot at repeatedly with no harm whatsoever if you wore plate armor. And then eventually some bright spark got the idea of not just let's make it fire more often, but bigger, leading to the cannon. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.